In the fast-paced, now a go-go world of big box retail, we're probably familiar with the customer service desk. It's where you go for returns, gift registry, or to locate any known ostriches that have escaped from the local zoo. And in the toy collecting world, well, we're probably familiar with this too because, well, returns are a natural part of our hobby. And while there's sometimes no substitutions, exchanges, or refunds, when we do have to bring a toy back, there's always the question of where does it go? And that's what Machine Man asked, wanting to know how much does it cost to the manufacturer and where do returns go? Are they repackaged? Well, let's look into that. And to understand that, we first have to look at the structure of retail and the requirements of said people at retail that are interacting with the customers. And by this I mean the sales clerks. So sales clerks are there for various reasons, but mostly to help you find items. One thing, though, they're not always is super experts. I mean, they may know a lot about their particular store layout or where to find things, like if you need to get the extra spicy ketchup, but they're probably not going to know about the entire background of every single item, and in particular with things like action figures, understanding when the wrong figure is returned inside of a box. That can't be an expectation that retail clerks are expected to know because their investigation abilities are limited and their time and bandwidth is limited. So things like returning the wrong figure, yeah, these retail clerks, exchange clerks are basically there to help facilitate the return. They're not there to examine the return. They'll take it back, probably give you your money or store credit or at least a chicken and cow, but they're not going to understand that you're trying to, return a He-Man figure inside of a Mighty Spector box. That's just not something that can be expected, and it's going to happen. Now, in addition to the years and years that I've spent in the toy industry, I've actually spent time as a retail clerk. Before I was in the toy industry, my first job was in retail. In fact, it was working in a comic book store. Big shocker. When I was 13, I got my first paying job showing comic books and hacking comic books. In fact, when I Googled working in a comic book shop, I found this video, and I'm like, wait a minute, I know Mike Wellman. He was the manager at the comic book store I used to go to in Manhattan Beach before I moved from California. That was kind of cool. It has nothing to do with anything, but I figured I'd give a free plug for the Comic Bug if you happen to be in Manhattan Beach, because, yeah, Mike runs a good ship there. The comic store I actually worked in was this one. Before it was called Alakazam, it was called Planet X, and before that it was called Metropolis, but they had to change their name because there was a club in town called Metropolis, and that made them change their name because they didn't want people mixing them up. It was located in beautiful Irvine, California, in a shopping center that used to be known as the Marketplace, but then also had to change its name to the University Center, not because of the Metropolis Club. Interestingly, this was also the shopping center where the world headquarters of In-N-Out Burger is, but that has absolutely nothing to do with returns and refunds or the subject of this video. I just thought I'd throw it in because I like In-N-Out Burger. All right. So, after working in a comic book store, I then went on to work at Barnes & Noble because if you haven't noticed from some of my videos, I also have a thing for books. And working at Barnes & Noble, I really got to understand the return system because you would have a lot of inventory coming in and a lot of inventory going out. And again, while booksellers were expected to understand a lot about books and magic things like Harry Potter wands, understanding what to do with the refunds and returns was basically standardized. They'd be put into a basket, they'd be put onto a cart, and divided up into two different categories, just like toys. That's why I'm talking about this. Bear with me. I'm making a point. I promise. All right, so anything put back in a bookstore or a toy store, a big box store, is called a putback. That's the technical term. And so putbacks are allocated usually to a special cart, and if the item is still in sellable condition, it's simply put back on the shelf. So, the Wolverine figure that you're returning, if it's not opened and it's in usable, sellable condition, unlike this Stephen King book, it will just simply be placed back on the planogram. But if it is like this Stephen King book and it's missing the cover, well, that means it's damaged and unsellable, and it's considered useless not useless, but it can no longer be sold. And it's returned to sender, meaning it's brought back to the manufacturer. Now, there's a rumor in the toy industry that manufacturers of toys in particular repackage goods. But, there's a reason that doesn't happen, and I'm going to go into that. If the toy, just like previous said books, is in sellable condition, the blister looks fine, the character is sellable, etc., it's not on clearance, just put back on the planogram and hung back in the toy aisle where we can all find it again. Wonderful end of the story. But if said toy is damaged, and whether that's because the blister is broken or the toy is defective, and that does happen with toys, that's when it's returned to the manufacturer, and the retailer will do this in bulk, usually once a month. And it's why some manufacturers have toys that have warnings about returning them, like Meccano. If you've ever opened a Meccano set, you will see the first thing is a flyer urging you not to return this toy to the retailer without calling customer service, because these things are really hard to put together, and a lot of people are discouraged and just return them. And the reason they have this warning inside Meccano boxes is because it costs the manufacturer a lot of money to accept and process returns. So they want to try to discourage these, especially if you're just returning it because you're frustrated with the product versus actually having a defective product. Like I said, Meccano is really hard to put together and gets a lot of returns, hence having a flyer inside of them telling you not to return it, to call customer service for help. All right, so then let's get through the truth, lies, and mysticism of what manufacturers do with these toys. So it's a well-known, little-known fact that most toys are made in Asia, usually Hong Kong, Vietnam, one of those countries, China, etc. And they have to be brought to the US. Most of the time this is done using sea ship, which is those giant cargo ships that you see floating outside of Long Beach Harbor that can't seem to park because there are too many of them right now and they can't coordinate it with the dock workers. But that's a whole other problem that's related to COVID. Now, if you can't sea ship an item, there is the opportunity, or rather option, to airship. Now, this is a seldom used option, specifically because it costs a lot of money. The only time you will ship something by air is if you have to make a specific deadline, such as a movie release date, or there's a certain store promotion, but a cost-benefit analysis is done to decide whether or not shipping it by air is worth it, because shipping costs a lot of money, especially when you ship by air. It's about 10 times the cost of sea shipping. It's avoided at all costs, but I've seen it happen. So what happens to these toys then that are returned and are defective? Well, if you've seen Toy Story 3, honestly, it really is a lot like that. Toys that don't work are basically destroyed because it's less expensive to destroy them stateside than to reship them to Hong Kong, with the idea that you would then repackage them and ship them to consumers. That's why you see so many toys that don't sell being sold on clearance. The least expensive option is to clear out the product, even if it's for a fraction of the SRP or A price, meaning the cost that you sold it to the retailer for. Because a clearanced item that's at least sold for good money, even if it's less expensive money, is money you don't have to spend destroying the product, because that can add up, and companies obviously want to have as big of a profit as possible. To understand this and to actually understand why legally companies can't just take product and resell it if it's defective, well, you actually have to go in and understand the accounting principles that govern publicly traded companies like the big toy manufacturers, Jax, Spin Master, Mattel, Hasbro. Well, Spin Master's on the Canadian stock market, but it still is. So to understand this, we have to have just a quick look at GAAP. What GAAP is, and it's not the English tube system, it's called GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. This is what governs how all publicly traded companies have to manage their books. And it's a way of understanding every aspect of accounting, from historical costs to the way goods are processed, the way monetary units are tracked, and it's standardized so that all companies are doing it the same way. Now, one of the important things about GAAP, besides the fact that it stands for Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, is that it governs any company that is publicly owned and that is traded on the stock market, that has shares, that there are owners. And you are required not only to use it, but to follow it. And that means that by breaking it, you are violating SEC rules and are subject to heavy fines. So that becomes the governing rule preventing toy companies, if you will, from just reselling items that are returned. What they do under GAAP, and this is part of the process, is they make an allocation for sales, discounts, and returns. But, as noted, if the company makes this allowance, they cannot return inventory, or rather they cannot return inventory to a store because they've already accounted for it in their income sheet. So that's how it's done. It's done in the income sheet, not by physical product. It's not really about not wanting to, it's that they can't, because GAAP standards that govern publicly traded companies prevent them from doing this. So the rumor that toy companies are reissuing product that was returned, maybe in a slightly different package or with a different paint job even, are absolutely bogus. You can't do this. If you see new product showing up in a new package, it's a new manufacturing run. It's not the old product that was recycled or repackaged or reused. It has to be a new run, and this is because of financial records. Now, if you violate these and you violate the rules, obviously you're going to face high fines, public scrutiny, and if you're on a ship, public flogging. And if there's anything we know, toy companies do not like to be publicly flogged. If you like this video, I hope it answered your questions about what happens to returns and how accounting principles are actually responsible for governing it. Leave a comment below. Let me know what you think. If I missed anything, I'm happy to do a follow-up and I'll respond to every comment. Thanks for watching, sharing, liking, and subscribing, and I'll see you guys next time. This is Spector Creative.